Our next chapters deal with the New Frontier and the Great Society. It's chapter 20. Our quiz is also going to include chapter 21 with the Civil Rights Movement. So two chapters in for this unit. We're going to begin talking about kind of the political situation as we move into the 1960s in the United States of America. In the presidential election of 1960, both candidates for both of the major parties have similar opinions. The Republicans are running Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon has been known to Americans for a long time at this point. He was the vice president of the United States from 1952 to 1960 with Dwight Eisenhower. He's running pretty much on if you vote for the Republicans, you're voting for a continuation of the policies and promises of the 1950s. And Nixon is also running on a campaign of being known to be very anti-communist and a strong foreign policy to stand up to the Soviet Union and other problems around the world. The Democrats are running John F. Kennedy. He is the current senator from Massachusetts. He's a well-known World War II hero. He's a famous author at this point, and his idea is to try to get America moving again. He's going to use his youthful image in order to be able to kind of counteract what the Republicans are doing and ask for change in this new decade. And so both Kennedy and Nixon are going to campaign pretty ferociously throughout 1960 for this. Nixon hurts his knee real bad in the fall of 1960 as the campaign's about to heat up. And so the both candidates promised not to campaign publicly. Nixon because he's hurt, and Kennedy to be sporting for a couple days because of that from this. Now, the presidential election of 1960 has two key events happen along the campaign trail as the United States moves towards Election Day in November. The first major event that happens is on September 26, 1960. And this is the first televised presidential debates ever in American history. The reason for this is to put both of the candidates in front of the parties together on television. Both the campaigns, both political parties agree to do this, and they go and do that. Now, Kennedy was coached by TV people. He was able to kind of go through all the stuff. He picked his different outfits from this, and he was able to really kind of be put on the stage from this for there. He really looks the part. When we show um the video of the debate, you'll be able to see that Kennedy chose a very dark suit to help contrast with the light gray background. Kennedy was wearing a white shirt underneath the suit jacket when he first went out there in the prelim, like to check all the lighting and stuff from there. And his campaign said it looks too harsh under the monitors and the lights, so he changed quickly before airtime into a light blue shirt to help play on this, and he also used kind of television knowledge for makeup and other stuff. Nixon, on the other hand, is recovering from an illness. He's lost 5 pounds since being in the hospital. He banged his knee real bad on the door of his car going into the studio, and so he's not he also wore very little makeup. His aides and stuff had to do a lot of kind of behind the scenes work to get the lighting for him that was kind of jumbled and monkeyed around uh, unconsciously and inconspicuously by members of the media who were taking pictures of there. He's very little makeup. And so what all this does is to help kind of show two different sides to this debate. People who tuned into the radio to hear this said that it was a draw or that Nixon, a much better debater, was the clear winner of this. Whereas people who saw the debate on TV unequivocally said that John F. Kennedy won. And again, if you see the debate and you watch the whole hour of it, Kennedy is clearly speaking to the American people. He's putting a lot of out there, whereas Nixon, the debater, is making rebuttals and counterpoints and other stuff to make to not harshly attack Kennedy, but his policies and other stuff. So from there, the clear big takeaway of this debate, though, is that it shows the effect of television on politics, which is going to have, especially as we move into the present time period, a giant effect from this. This is a major game changer in terms of presidential campaigns. The other major event occurs a month later, on October 19th of 1960. This is where civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested. Now, he was arrested for refusing to leave a segregated restaurant in Atlanta with 52 other people inside there. King, however, is the only one to be sentenced to 4 months hard labor. And in the midst of the civil rights movement, and from this, a lot of people are concerned that he's never going to make those 4 months of hard labor because he's going to be killed or something. As an accident's going to happen from there. So this is a pretty, particularly for Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement and the organization around him, it is a pretty fraught time from there. Kennedy is going to conspicuously call Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife, Mrs. King, to offer his support and aid, and the Kings are going to publicly acknowledge that he went and did this. And behind the scenes and other stuff, Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother and campaign manager, pulls a lot of strings in the Justice Department and in other stuff in order to be held Martin Luther King Jr. released from prison. Nixon sends privately is going to talk to the Kings, but it's the Kennedys who are able to public do that really help out the stuff, and basically it helps deliver a lot of African American votes to the Kennedy campaign. So this is the momentous event, the 1960 presidential debates held on TV. And again, this is the first time that's happened in American history, and we're going to watch a clip from that right now.
Has been agreed will be restricted to internal or domestic American matters. And now for the first opening statement by Senator John F. Kennedy.
Smith, Nixon. In the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln said the question was whether this nation could exist, half slave or half free. In the election of 1960, and with the world around us, the question is whether the world will exist, half slave or half free, whether it will move in the direction of freedom, in the direction of the road that we are taking, or whether it will move in the direction of slavery.
Senator Kennedy, the things that Senator Kennedy has said, many of us can agree with. There is no question but that we cannot discuss our internal affairs in the United States without recognizing that they have a tremendous bearing on our international position. There is no question but that this nation cannot stand still because we are in a deadly competition, a competition not only with the men in the Kremlin, but the men in Peking. We're ahead in this competition, as Senator Kennedy, I think, has implied. But when you're in a race, the only way to stay ahead is to move ahead.
So a little bit of the debate there for you. You can kind of see the different contrasting styles and stuff from there. The election of 1960 is very close. John F. Kennedy is going to win by a pretty slim margin of over only just 119,000 votes in a couple of different states here and there. Now, to this day, and especially even in the time period from there, there's lots of rumors of voting shenanigans in Chicago, particularly on election night. Stuff and back alley deals with Mayor Daley, pretty much who runs the Democratic machine in Chicago, and then with other places, particularly on the East Coast as well. Some other stuff, so you can kind of on your own, if you want to dial in there, know that these just exist, and that going into the counting of Chicago, John F. Kennedy was losing the race, and by the end of the voting in Chicago, Kennedy is winning the race, and so you can kind of see how that follows in from there. Now, Kennedy, as president and along the campaign trail, is going to have a great relationship with the press. He's one of the master manipulators of the press, and also be able to kind of work with them, be able to have a public relationship with them. He's also has his beautiful wife, Jackie Kennedy, and two young kids along there, and so he's very portraying this youthful image that he's going to bring change to Washington, change that people can believe in. Kennedy is also going to surround himself with what he called the best and brightest, a group of young advisors and cabinet members to kind of bring this idea of youthful change and leadership into the halls of Washington. So this is on the the vote for Kennedy. This is a New York mobster who's counting from there, and you can kind of see on the election night some of the stuff that is going on with the Kennedys behind the scenes. Kennedy himself is from the Kennedy family led by Joseph P. Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy made a ton of money during Prohibition, doing all rum running and stuff, and he had the presence of mind to sell a lot of that businesses and then parlay that into movie theaters, and that was able to amass this giant Kennedy family fortune to be able to fund the Kennedys for a very, very long time after that. Kennedy himself grew up in a big family. Um, was not really picked to be the one to go into a political career from that. His older brother was, but during World War II, his older brother died in on a bombing run in a plane, and so it was up to Kennedy, who's gonna after the war, who the Joseph Kennedy is gonna put all his things there. During World War II, Kennedy is a PT boat commander, and his ship is actually attacked and split in half from there. And during that attack, his back is pretty much going to break. And with that broken back and severely burned, he's going to rescue members of his PT boat, the famous PT 109, swim several miles with their life jackets kind of straps in his teeth to an island and be able to pick up. And he's going to suffer from this accident pretty much for the rest of his life, which is going to have some consequences for that later on. Um, After the war, you can kind of see Kennedy in the background here. He's going to tour Europe. He's going to run for a congressman in Boston, and then from there work up to become a senator from there. In the early 1950s, he marries his wife, Jacqueline Onassis, and they grow up. And again, from there, and she does a very good job, again, in kind of portraying the president's wife. And she also, as the first lady, does a major restoration of the White House, particularly working with a lot of historians and antiques dealers to bring a lot of the history of the White House back up there. She famously on Valentine's Day in 1962, which is what this TV guide is going, does a tour of the White House to much fanfare and really kind of brings the American people back into their house. Again, with two young children, Caroline Kennedy and John F. Kennedy Jr. This kind of really brings this mystique of this kind of loving family from there in Kennedy's personal life. And then again, he famously says he's going to surround himself with the best and brightest, these groups of people to try to bring change to Washington. One of the changes that he brings is a new military strategy. The American people and the people in the high command are really kind of trying to move away from the policy of the 1950s that President Eisenhower relied on the idea of a massive nuclear retaliation to deter Soviet aggression and imperialism. The idea that the Soviets are only going to stand up to extreme strength, and so you need to be willing to stand up there with a massive nuclear strike, keep them from doing that. Kennedy himself and others in his administration are worried about using nuclear weapons, and so they changed their policy to what's called flexible response. Flexible response is a military policy that involves preparing a variety of military responses to international crises rather than focusing just on the use of nuclear weapons. The idea that you can be flexible with your response, right? Instead of a conflict arising and you only being able to drop nuclear bombs, maybe you can choose something short of that. What this entailed on a more day-to-day function was an increased spending on conventional military forces, actual guys with guns and boats and stuff like that. He Kennedy also created an elite branch of the armed forces, will be called the Green Berets, and will actually keep a Green Beret on his desk for several months after this, after their creation. From there, kind of as a special forces unit, be able to use an even smaller group of highly trained elite armed forces to go into there, while also tripling overall nuclear capabilities during his presidency. And so again, you have different options on the table, and that's what Kennedy was trying to work toward with this idea of flexible response. And this is him visiting, training Navy SEALs and the Army Green Berets here to kind of get this idea of him going and doing that. He needed this flexible response due to crises occurring in Cuba. And this mainly deals with the rise of Fidel Castro. Castro, as a communist backer, uh, went into Cuba and he ousted the Cuban Batista government in 1959. And as a communist, Castro increasingly relies on the aid of the Soviet Union and begins to brutally crack down on political dissension in Cuba to establish a Cuban communist party dictatorship on the island there. A sizable exile group of Cubans leaving Cuba under the Castro Communist Revolution begin to urge more and more publicly for American intervention in Cuba from there. This helps kind of push further this idea that's being developed in the United States of what's called domino theory. And this really comes out of what we'll talk about in our next unit in Vietnam. In 1954, with President Dwight D. Eisenhower talking about the problems in Southeast Asia. And this is the idea, a domino theory, that if one nation falls under communist control, then like a row of dominoes set up on end and you tip it over, all nearby nations will then fall under communist control one by one. So you have to keep that first domino from falling in order to be able to keep communism from spreading. Again, the idea of containment that we've talked about in previous chapters as well. That's cute that this is developed in Southeast Asia, particularly in and around Vietnam in the 1950s. However, this is being then applied in this chapter right here to Cuba. Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida. And the idea then becomes that if Cuba is now fall under communist rule, what's to stop other Latin or South American nations right here in the Western Hemisphere from also falling to communism as well? So that's Fidel Castro, even though he's pretty famous for being a pretty brutal dictator, as well as being a fan of basketball and also baseball as well. And the idea of domino theory, again, comes out of the problems occurring in the 1950s in Southeast Asia, but are directly applied in this situation to Cuba and Latin America. So the United States moving into the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution, decides they need to remove Castro. And on March of 1960, while he's president, President Dwight D. Eisenhower gives the CIA permission to train Cuban exiles in Guatemala to invade Cuba to remove Castro. Kennedy is informed of this plan of the CIA 9 days into office. So Kennedy, in kind of this big, huge, giant sweep of things that are going on, very quickly learns this plan. And as a new president, still trying to learn out the ropes, and the CIA and all this other kind of stuff pushing along kind of goes along with it. And so on April 17th of 1961, this plan is put in place, and it leads to the invasion of Cuba, beginning with the Bay of Pigs, where 1,500 Cuban exiles are landed with American help, and they found themselves pretty much annihilated and captured by 25,000 Cuban troops backed up with Soviet tanks, guns, and air support. The United States really has to pay for this. Not only is this one of the worst military disasters, kind of with that's associated with the United States, they have to pay $53 million in order to be able to save face not only to Cuba but also in the world community. And Castro becomes even more paranoid and more reliant on Soviet aid because he can point out to, hey, right here, the Americans are trying to go and attack us, and from there. So the whole Bay of Pigs situation is a big debacle from the get go. The CIA is funding, like we said, Cuban exiles in Florida, sending them to Guatemala. Pretty much most of them are former Batista soldiers who are being trained there, and then from there they're kind of on a roundabout route sent to the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, where pretty much they make no progress at all militarily and are captured and annihilated from there. It's a major problem. Kennedy wants to limit American kind of overt involvement as much as they can, but it's still American jets escorting American bombers right up to Cuban airspace. Americans tank or sorry fuel tanks are jettisoned that are blazoned United States Army on the side. The first people ashore on the Bay of Pigs invasion are Navy SEALs, which and CIA frogmen, who Kennedy was assured was never going to happen. So it becomes a major big issue. And even in 1962, Kennedy is promising some of the survivors that he's going to free them, which they're able to do. So it's this increased tensions that Cuba begins asking for the Soviet Union to begin sending more and more aid to help them out. So Khrushchev, in the summer of 1962, begins sending nuclear missiles, to Cuba in order to be able to further their protection of the communists in Cuba. Uh, October 14th of 1962, the United States finally goes public, knowing about it since September, that they have photographic evidence of nuclear missiles in Cuba. And so it takes about a week for Kennedy to respond. And October 22nd, Kennedy makes a famous TV address about the missiles. There, after going back and forth with members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his cabinet, whether they want to invade Cuba, whether they want to bomb the living daylights out of Cuba, or whether they want to do something else, he decides to come up with a blockade of Cuba. A blockade, using that term, is a act of war, and it's an act of war dating back for centuries. And so Kennedy, trying to be as tough as possible without trying to bring about nuclear annihilation or a third world war, announces a quarantine of Cuba. And so it's a good it's a way of saying it's a blockade without actually saying it's a blockade from there. This leads to a very tense few days in October of 1962. This is one of the closest the world has ever come to a full-out nuclear war. There's stories of nuclear-armed Soviet submarines who are being pinged by like sonar waves and are being harassed by U.S. destroyers who can't get any information from the Kremlin, who have their fingers on the nuclear launch buttons before cooler heads kind of prevail as the arms and stuff is being backed from there. And finally, after going back and forth and some lots of incriminations on either side, a deal is finally reached before November of 1962. The deal publicly is that the Soviet Union will remove missiles from Cuba, and the Soviet Union will and Cuba will receive from the United States a promise not to invade Cuba, to let it exist as a communist nation. That's the public deal that's given out from there. However, in secret, the Soviet ambassador to the United States is granted and works with the Attorney General at this point, Robert Ed Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy says that the United States is also going to remove outdated and obsolete missiles in Turkey anyways, and so this is kind of a tit for tat response. The Soviet Union removes its missiles from Cuba, the United States removes its missiles from Turkey, and that's basically what goes down and transpires in probably one of the most tense periods of the Cold War to date. So this is what the United States begins to find when they're doing reconnaissance flyovers from the U-2 spy planes of Cuba. They begin to see military encampments and convoys, and then later these missile sites from there. One of the major uh, key characteristics that it was the Soviets that were helping the Cubans was that the Americans begin noticing a lot of soccer fields being erected in Cuba, and the Cubans don't play soccer, they play baseball. And so this was a key tip off that, wait a second, there's actually Soviets in here doing a lot of stuff as they're erecting these nuclear missiles. And so these missile sites there in the X's were known to the United States, and they're from there. And these are our with these missiles would be able to reach places like Washington D.C. and Miami and other major parts of the United States in order to be able to do that. And the United States really couldn't have this Soviet kind of presence in the Western Hemisphere, as they're, again, only 90 miles from the United States. So Kennedy sits down with his Joint Chiefs of Staff, and his um, cabinet, and you can see kind of his daily planner kept by a secretary. As you can see all the meetings and other stuff that he's going and doing. As for a 13-day period, they really sit and try to keep the world from reaching atomic war. Um, the uh, the debate kind of goes back and forth between a strike with fighter jets and bombers to attack the missile sites themselves, or again this idea of a blockade. Before the nation addresses that, and we'll see a clip of that speech in a second.
Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. This quarantine will be extended, if needed, to other types of cargo and carriers. We are not at this time, however, denying the necessities of life, as the Soviets attempted to do in their Berlin blockade of 1948.
So that's what Kennedy is pushing for from there, and also calling for an increased surveillance of Cuba to make sure that they're meeting those different protocols from there. So again, it's a blockade in all but name only, and the quarantine is a key from there. And again, it goes down to the American destroyers there in gray meeting these Soviet tankers and trying to see if they're going to go and back down. And it's the Khrushchev administration that eventually does that. The United States does prepare for war. This is the closest, highest war footing the United States was on during the entire Cold War, particularly defending itself in Florida near Key West. And in terms of the United Nations, the ambassador to United Nations for the United States, Adlai Stevenson, famously goes in front of the UN and really hammers home on the Soviet Union to admit that they put these missiles in Cuba, which they were kind of reluctant to. And when he's able to show them, it really helps turn world opinion against the Soviet Union. And again, it's another key development towards that. The next thing we want to talk about is the Berlin Wall. Before we do that, just really quickly, an interesting kind of small dalliance in the Cold War is Operation Gold, and that's where the CIA and the British intelligence MI6 constructed a 400-yard tunnel from western to eastern Berlin in 1953 in order to be able to tap telephone cables between the Soviet high command in Berlin and Moscow. This tunnel is really an engineering marvel. The metal braces on it were rubberized as not to claim to make any noises. It was air conditioned so that the heat from all electrical wiring wouldn't melt any of the snow in the wintertime. And it was started from a giant building with a huge satellite array on its roof to kind of give the idea that, oh, you should be monitoring all the radio signals out there and not the tunnel underneath it. But like most of the stuff in the Cold War, the Soviets knew all about it. They make a big show of discovering it in 1956, and they mostly use it to be able to send disinformation from Moscow into intelligence stuff from there. But again, just one of the many kind of different things that show you the different spy stuff that's going on from there. The next thing that's going to happen, again, is this idea of the Berlin Wall. The existence of West Berlin within East Germany is a major irritant, we said, of both Stalin and Khrushchev. We talked before about the Berlin blockade of 1948 and how the Soviet Union kind of backed down from there. And the reason this is an irritant is that from 1949, the end of the blockade, through 1961, over 2.5 million people have fled from East to West Germany by using kind of some of the loopholes of being able to go from East Germany into East Berlin and then smuggling themselves into West Berlin and then out into West Germany. So on August 13th, 1961, with Soviet approval, East German police began erecting a wall around the eastern section of Berlin, of West Berlin, basically to wall the West Berliners in there and keep them from escaping. The wall itself ran 28 miles straight through the city center itself, and a 75-mile long wall surrounded West Berlin from East Germany. The border between East and West Germany was separated by walls, electric fences, and death strips that were watched by armed guards, with the idea that anybody who stepped into those strips of land was facing would be shot on sight with no questions asked from there. So the Berlin Wall really is erected very quickly. It starts right on that morning where the East German police shows up on that line, and then begin to hastily kind of throw this up as quickly as they can. You can see the development as it kind of moves from there. People quickly kind of realized pretty soon what this was dealing, and so you have episodes like this girl running right across, people escaping through buildings or kind of punching their way through there as people begin to see pretty quickly what all this entails before kind of in its final form, the wall that is set up from there. Most of the wall is actually built into East Berlin. And there's the one wall itself from there. But again, death strips, barbed wire fences, armed guards, depressions in the ground to make it from there. Stuff that's raked daily to make sure you can't see any new footprints, be able to see where people are escaping, and other things of that nature from there. And this really becomes a symbol of the Cold War and of the separation of the German state from there. And so people are going to live through this separated from relatives on one side of the wall from the other. Checkpoint Charlie in the American sector becomes a famous way of moving in between from there, and people live with this wall up to its being taken down in 1989, and you can still see the effect of the Berlin Wall from space, as you can see the lights between East Berlin and West Berlin are actually different types of light bulbs and different types of light stanchions, and so the effect of the Berlin Wall is still seen from space today. In East Germany, the Stasi secret police are used to enforce order and to stop any escapes. In West Berlin, the wall was mocked, and you can see it was full of graffiti from the outside from there. And it's famously going to be used for a lot of American speeches. President Kennedy's famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, which we'll see a selection from in a second, and Ronald Reagan in the 80s going to West Berlin and saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, which we'll talk about in the 80s. The Stasi secret police files are pretty, in East Berlin, sorry, East Germany is probably one of the most spied on societies in all of world history. It's estimated that 9 out of every 10 people in East Germany was a spy for the East German government. So everybody's spying on each other. And if you've seen the movie The Lives of Others, which won an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Picture, it does a pretty good job of the interrogation techniques and all the stuff that they're doing to spy on everybody from there. And those are all the files it has on all the people in there. Kennedy is famously going to go in front of the Berlin Wall in 1963 and give his famous speech standing up for freedom at its, what's that?
Have the ring of an affirmation. Freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. When all are free, then we can look forward to that day when this city will be joined as one, and this country, and this great continent of Europe, in a peaceful and hopeful globe. When that day finally comes, as it will, the people of West Berlin can take sober satisfaction in the fact that they were in the front lines for almost 2 decades. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
So the speeches like that to West Berlin and or with other crises, there's a lot of tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, and through the rest of the 1960s, pretty much after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy looks to tone down the hardline stance that he's taken upon his immediate arrival in there. 1963, the Soviet Union and the United States agrees to installing a hotline between the White House and the Kremlin. In movies, this takes kind of the image of a red telephone that's supposed to, it's really a teletype type situation, but it's pretty much a direct line between the two that's used on the hour to test it to make sure it's there, but be able to kind of, if something comes up, to be able to talk about it from there, to be able to enable the countries to communicate immediately if crisis arises and you're not trying to guess what the other person's trying to do. In terms of also trying to ease tensions, nuclear talks were held, and Kennedy and the Soviet Union agreed in 1963 to the Limited Test Ban Treaty. And this barred nuclear testing in the atmosphere. So you can't just go and blow up atomic bombs in atmosphere anymore, but you can still go and do it underground, but to try to limit some of the radiation from there. So this is the actual hotline. This is Johnson's thing he's using, but again, set up during the Kennedy presidency. This is the machine. Again, in movies, it's going to be a red telephone on the president's desk, but that's really not the actual case. It's going to be this machine from there. In other cases of um, trying to ease tensions. It includes the Soviet Union sending the Kennedys a dog, and so this is a dog who's descended from one of the dogs sent from space, which we'll talk about in our next lecture, to be able to kind of a stab like kind of in the side of the United States, saying, "Hey, look here, we're sending you relative to the space dog," but also the idea that trying to help out and try to back things down from there. And so that kind of culminates in this idea of the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty, which Kennedy is signing right there. Kennedy is really running on and is bringing to the American people in the campaign of 1960 his promise of progress. And so his program called the New Frontier is his broad vision of progress of ideas for the United States. He wants to provide medical care for the elderly. He wants to rebuild blighted urban areas, kind of the decay of inner cities. He wants to increase aid for education, all while trying to bolster national defense. To be able to improve in the international arena, Kennedy was astutely aware that the decolonialization and kind of independence movements in Asia and in Africa were going to be ripe breeding grounds for communism or other anti-American talk. And so, kind of bringing in this idea of idealism and progress, Kennedy established the Peace Corps to send United States volunteers abroad to kind of not only help modernize and build up infrastructure in some of these African and Asian countries, but also to conspicuously say that, hey, this help's being brought to you by the red, white, and blue, the United States of America. Here's a Coca-Cola. Don't go over to communism. In terms of the Western Hemisphere, he established the Alliance for Progress, where Latin America would get economic and technical assistance, again, to do this conspicuously so that they know it's coming from the United States, so they're not going over to communism. Kennedy also looked to expand the space program, which again we'll get into in our next lecture in more detail. And he kind of really does this famously in his first inaugural address in 1961. One of the things that we want to talk about is Kennedy's kind of social impact. Before we go here, is that you can see all the hats on all the different people from there. And President Kennedy in January is not wearing a hat, and this is going to be a major step, kind of sectorally for American men, is to kind of they move away from wearing like your fedora or a dress hat out in public to kind of a bare head. And so Kennedy's going to deliver a pretty famous message in his first inaugural, and we're going to listen to a clip of it right here.
In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
This is going to kind of be Kennedy's clarion call for his idea of progress and change for the 1960s. So again, one of the key things that he says in terms of American goodwill abroad is the Peace Corps. And so you can kind of see what the Peace Corps provided with some people as a candidate there. And I get this a Norman Rockwell painting that kind of has this idea of tapping into this rise of the nation's youth to be able to go out and spread American values and American ingenuity and technology to the rest of the world. And so Kennedy, with this Peace Corps, as he's meeting the first kind of volunteers who signed up there at the White House, is a big proponent of that, along with going into Latin America and South American countries where he was greeted with great fanfare to go and export these ideas from there. And so that's where we're going to stop with our story here, and we'll start with our next lecture on the idea of not only taking this idea of American change and progress overseas, but taking it to outer space.